In order to ensure the safety of our food supply, it may sometimes be necessary to implement risk management measures to reduce consumer exposure to undesirable compounds such as contaminants in food. These contaminants may enter food via the presence in the environment or may be formed during processing of food. ILSI Europe has developed a scientific framework to help facilitate the assessment of mitigation measures intended to reduce consumer exposure to contaminants. The risk assessment process for contaminants in food involves the evaluation of safety data on that contaminant, the preparation of a detailed consumer exposure assessment utilising occurrence data for that contaminant and food consumption data. If the level of exposure exceeds the safety level, then it may be necessary to implement risk management measures to reduce consumer exposure. It is, however, important to consider in advance how the success of any mitigation measure will be measured and how any uncertainties in the original risk assessment may impact on the ability to measure reductions in exposure levels. The ILSI task force developed a stepwise approach to assess the effectiveness of dietary exposure assessment. The framework starts with the risk assessment process and the need to understand both the outcome of the assessment and the uncertainties in the data supporting the conclusions from the risk assessment. A number of control measures may be identified in order to reduce consumer exposure. These can range from giving dietary advice to implementing changes in manufacturing processes. It is important to consider both the intended consequences of these measures as well as any unintended consequences which could negate the overall improvement on the safety position. Ideally, before implementing any control measure to reduce dietary exposure, you must consider how you will determine whether that measure is successful. Having good baseline data on consumer exposure is essential in order to measure any change in the exposure level resulting from the introduction of the control measure. Emerging issues may impact the ability to measure the success of that control measure in reducing exposure. The conclusions from the assessment should feed back into the original risk assessment. The ILSI Europe Task Force utilised a number of case studies to evaluate the framework. One of these case studies was the presence of methylmercury in fish. Consumption of certain types of fish leads to safety levels for this contaminant being exceeded by certain population subgroups, including pregnant women. In order to reduce dietary exposure, pregnant women are advised to avoid consumption of these fish types. The case study looks at the challenges of measuring the impact of this dietary advice on exposure to methylmercury via fish intake. For more information on the framework and the case studies, this can be found in the publication by Van der Velde Clerks et al. In Food Chemical Toxicology.